In a beautiful passage from Isaiah, God calls to us, "Listen to me, you who pursue justice, you who seek Adonai. Look to the rock you were hewn from, to the quarry you were dug from. Look back to Abraham your father and to Sarah who brought you forth." Last Shabbat, our most recent bar mitzvah, Jonah Eichler, in his wonderfully thoughtful Devar Torah, helped us look back to our founding ancestors as heroes, characters with serious flaws, but heroes nonetheless. And in her online Devar Torah, Rabbi Mona Strick, inspired by God's command to Avram, Lech Lecha, opened up for us deeper understandings of what it can mean to embark on a journey toward an unknown destination. This story of the first generation of our Jewish family stretches through 12 chapters, about 25% of the first book of the Torah. As we tell and retell it, helped by centuries of commentary and interpretation, we tend to define it for ourselves as the story of Abraham and God. But what about the story of Sarah and God? We've taught ourselves to refer to the founding patriarchs and matriarchs, to say in our liturgy, Elohei Avraham ve'Elohei Sarah, God of Abraham and God of Sarah, separately. But that's not how we tell the story, and for good reason. The biblical text clearly considers Abraham to be the central character of this story, and the central relationship to be Abraham and God. As soon as we ask my question, we're faced with a fragmentary and ambiguous narrative. Nevertheless, if we shift our focus and bring Sarah and her relationship with God into the foreground, I think we can deepen our own spiritual repertoire from her complicated, flawed spiritual heroism. In contrast with Avraham, whom the text constantly presents as the recipient of divine attention and initiatives, Sarah lives her whole life in a mode of what the remarkable Torah teacher Aviva Zarnberg calls staunch realism. In Sarah's experience, Zornberg says, God has been more effectively hidden, and her faith, therefore, has been a more difficult faith than Abraham's, which is based on promises, transcendent intimations. From the biblical text, we have no way of knowing how Sarah experiences the journey she embarks on with Abraham, including the dangerous and potentially disastrous descent to Egypt. When she is held captive in Pharaoh's palace, the voice of the narrator asserts God's concern with her plight and intervention on her behalf. But we are not told how Sarah herself understands what happens to her. But a powerful midrash in Genesis Rabbah responds to this gap, dramatizing her experience of entrapment and danger and her awareness of the harsh reality pressing on her. I'm quoting, "All that night Sarah lay on her face, saying, 'Master of the universe, Abraham went out from his birthplace because of a promise, but I went out because of amanah, trust or faith. Abraham has gone out from this prison, but I am inside this prison.' The Holy One said to her, 'Everything I am about to do, I do for your sake. Everyone will say, it is because of Aldevar, Sarai, Avram's wife.'" Another midrash, with a play on words quoted by Rashi, understands the phrase Aldevar as "at the word of," understanding the narrator's statement, Yud-He Vav-He plagued Pharaoh at the word of Sarai. These midrashim give Sarah a voice. They read the text in a way that transforms her silent abandonment to the forces surrounding her into a powerful alliance with God, who is ready to respond to her need, literally to her word. Yet even these rabbinic responses to the silence in the text, which invests Sarah with power and control through her connection to God, also give voice to a sense of the difficulties in that connection. She cannot ignore the dangerous prison in which she finds herself. Her cry of protest recalls the absence of direct promise to her at the beginning of the journey, creating her need to actively construct her emunah, trust or faith. The Midrash, even as it expands the narrator's assurances of God's concern for her into a direct dialogue between Sarah and God, still conveys the ambiguity that characterizes her experience of God. At the end of last week's parashah, God blesses Avram, changing his name to Avraham, and similarly blesses Sarai, changing her name to Sarah, promising many descendants from both of them. The blessing for Sarah includes the explicit promise of a son to carry forward the covenant. When Abraham responds with incredulous laughter, Vayitzchak, and a push for his already existent firstborn, Ishmael, God insistently repeats that Sarah is to be the mother of the son who will carry forward the covenant, and even gives him a name, Yitzchak, meaning he laughs, exactly echoing Abraham's laughter. But this entire conversation takes place exclusively between God and Abraham. Nothing conveys both Sarah's realism and the complexity of the God-Sarah relationship better than the opening episode of this week's parashah, the annunciation of Sarah's incipient pregnancy at the age of 90. Sarah again is not addressed directly, but this time she overhears because she listens at the entrance to the tent, and the text becomes preoccupied with her response. As though justifying her astonishment, the narrator reminds us that Abraham and Sarah were not only old, but Sarah had stopped menstruating. The way of women had ceased for Sarah. Then Sarah laughed within herself, Vatitzchak b'liba, saying, "After I have become worn, is there to be pleasure for me, and my Lord is old." Sarah's laughter sounds remarkably similar to Abraham's, a laughter of surprise, even incredulity, based on clear-sighted awareness of reality. She too owns a share in the laughter boy's name, the text seems to indicate. But her laughter generates not just the reiterated assurance of renewed possibility given to Abraham, but a theological lesson, a lesson meant for her, yet not addressed to her directly. But Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh said to Avraham, "Now why does Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I really give birth now that I am old?' Is anything beyond Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh? At that set time I will return to you when time revives, and Sarah will have a son." God is responding to Sarah's inward probing and astonished questioning, yet still speaks directly only to Avraham, misquoting her in the process. Rashi, basing himself on Midrash, praises this revisionary tactic. Scripture changed her words for the sake of peace. God, in this view, is protecting their marriage from the shock of Sarah's candor. But in the history of Sarah's engagement with God, this misquotation delivers a shock to an equally important relationship, that between Sarah and the God of covenantal promises. Traditional and modern commentators hear the overt statement of the theological principle is anything beyond Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh as a rebuke to Sarah. Why does her laughter deserve rebuke when Abraham's had evoked reassurance? Rashi directs us to the ancient Aramaic translation Onkelos, which translates the same Hebrew root with two different verbs. In Abraham's case, Vayitzchak means he rejoiced. For Sarah, Vatitzchak is translated she laughed at, she jested. From this we learn, according to Rashi, that Abraham trusted and rejoiced, but Sarah did not trust and mocked. Therefore, God responded with anger only to her doubt. The shift of one consonant, indicating the same verb with a feminine subject, signals to such commentators a move into a radically different spiritual world. Sarah also seems to hear God's words as a rebuke to her, because we are told that she responds with anxiety, even though the speech was ostensibly directed to Abraham. And I'm quoting the biblical texts. Sarah pretended otherwise, saying, "No, I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And this finally pushes God into speaking directly to her. But God said, "No, indeed, you laughed." We can hear this final assertion from God in a tone that transforms the unspoken as well as spoken dialogue. Up to this point, Sarah has been listening from the margins at the entrance to the tent and hears her own reaction revised into what she thinks is taken as unacceptable doubt. Her fear at being recognized and included, albeit indirectly, in the interaction, yet perhaps misunderstood, leads her to disclaim her own inner life. To this, God responds by acknowledging, even validating, what she has felt within herself. This first and only moment of direct dialogue between Sarah and God confirms that God has heard the silent voice of her inner reality in all its complexity. Reading God's response, not as rebuke but as affirmation, we can also hear the theological statement as reassurance instead of anger. Sarah, the one who earlier had seen most clearly the gap between divine promise and reality, acknowledges more fully than Abraham the physical impossibility of conception, reflecting as she does on the waning not only of her menstrual cycle, but of their sexual life. After I have become worn, is there to be pleasure for me? And my Lord is old. Her doubt and astonishment are therefore more deeply rooted. But in this dialogue, God responds to Sarah with the strongest possible assertion of divine capacity for the miraculous. What she from the margins heard as rebuke was meant as response to the intense conflict between doubt and hope expressed in that internal laughter. Far from requiring that she disclaim her laughter, God claims her as one whom God knows and finally speaks to directly. In the intensity of her spiritual struggle, Sarah has pushed God into establishing an unmediated relationship with her. From this perspective, the child's God-chosen name, Yitzchak, he laughs, reflects his mother's as much as his father's connection to the God who promises him into being. The difficulty and complication of the relationship between Sarah and God and Sarah, make her our teacher and our inspiration. Refusing to abandon her clear-eyed perception of reality and its distance from the promises made by the divine voice or the sacred text, she holds on to hope and stays loyal. It is precisely through her struggle with doubt and skepticism that she pushes God into manifesting presence, into direct speech. We may find the mode of roundabout communication, which a midrash sees as fit only for a woman, to be the most plausible source of hope for all of us. Unlike Abraham, to whom God calls and with whom God is persistently the initiator of connection and mission, Sarah actively constructs her awareness of God's workings in her life. She tries to push a flawed, incomplete reality into the shape she knows through faith that God has designed. Her activism also entails floundering and wrongdoing, yet we can derive reassurance from God's continuing presence to her, precisely in her flawed striving. God fulfills promises, does for Sarah as God had spoken. But fulfillment is only a moment, giving way to anxiety, struggle, complicity in morally problematic action. Sarah, from this perspective, is truly our ancestor. By entering her story, we can find a language to construct our own dialogue with God. Shabbat Shalom.